Good morning, everybody. If you wouldn't mind taking your seats. This is the first Mexico Institute event of the year, and I think it's the first time many of you have seen each other in at least, well, maybe 24 hours, but you're still catching up. All Mexico Institute events are highly social affairs. It's great to see you here. Thank you for braving the cold. If any of you feel bad about the weather, all you have to do is just look at that great article that was published a couple of days ago about the coldest village in the world, which got down to minus 80 Fahrenheit the other day, which they claimed was minus 62 Celsius, but I'm not going to do the math. And so when I got onto my little bicycle this morning and started pedaling down the hill, I thought it could be worse. By halfway, I thought it can't possibly be worse than this. But it's good to be here. I am so delighted that we have the opportunity to present two new reports. The first one by my colleague Chris Wilson, Deputy Director of the Mexico Institute, that was written at the end of last year, looking at trends in public opinion between Mexico and the United States, or U.S. Mexico relations. And Chris is going to lead us off in the discussion today. And then new data that has been produced by the Chicago Council in conjunction with Buendia y Laredo and the Mexico Institute here at the Wilson Center, that we're going to be talking about the new data that's coming out here. We're delighted that we have the opportunity to present this. Polling is not something that the Mexico Institute or the Wilson Center does very often, but we're very, very grateful for our relationship with the Chicago Council that we're able to dip our toe into this water every now and again. Of course, it's a critical issue at this juncture. By way of very, very brief introduction, and I'm not going to read the bios of the people here. You have them in front of you so that we can get to the conversation as quickly as possible. But by way of introduction, let me just share with you a conversation that I had in Mexico City yesterday, day before yesterday, and talking with one of our board members who is convinced that the current moment in U.S. Mexico relations is not only damaging in terms of public opinion now, but that it will leave a long-term mark. Now, my own view is different to that. My own view is that I think the public opinion bounces back depending on personalities, but we'll have to wait and see on that. But certainly, part of the conversation was, it matters a great deal whether or not this particularly difficult and trying period in bilateral relations is over soon, or whether it drags on for 4 years, for 8 years. And so it's something that clearly is occupying the mind of a lot of people down there. And despite the overall very, very positive feeling about the bilateral relationship and about United States citizens, right now I think that we are in a particularly difficult moment. So anyway, without any further ado, I will pass the microphone over to my colleague, Chris Wilson. We will have plenty of time, I hope, for conversation, dialogue towards the end of this session. And once again, thank you for being here. Chris.
Thanks very much, Duncan. I was going to, we lost that. So let me just, I'll say a couple things as we get started, and then we'll have the presentation hopefully pop up again. I'm going to just speak about, there's a whole bunch of stuff in the report, and my colleagues here have some brand new data to share, so I'm going to let them sort of do the very current view, but I'm going to try to look at a few trends that we identified in our report as a way to get a few insights into where we're at in the U.S. Mexico relationship in terms of public opinion. And I definitely just, reflecting on what Duncan just said, I think that's a really important question for us to be asking right now is, how long lasting is this crash in Mexican opinion of the United States? And one of the things that we can say, I wasn't going to present this, so let me just say it, is that we do see that Mexican opinion of the United States is very linked to personalities and policy in the United States. And so what I mean by that is that there's a degree of malleability that we've seen historically that does give one the impression that there's an ability to bounce back from difficult times. That said, there's another trend that I'm going to point at in just a second that makes me have some worries about where we're at in the long term as well. Can you pass the clicker down here, Duncan? Thanks. So I want to thank my co-authors who couldn't be here Pablo Pardas and Enrique Enriquez, both from Georgetown University, actually, and OPM is Pablo's company in Mexico, who helped me very much do this. And also just all of our colleagues that are pollsters, because as Duncan said, we don't get to create this data, so we really have to rely on our colleagues to provide this really important work for us to have really important insights into the relationship. All right, so there we go. So I'm going to start with, and I'm going to spend most of my time on U.S. perception of Mexico, actually, but pulling in some insights from the other side as well. But the thing that I want to start with here is that there's been, over the last couple of decades, a huge improvement in U.S. Mexico relations. Government-to-government relations, as of 2016, I mean, we're in a trying period right now, but as of 2016, we're probably at an all-time high. And you could have said that, every couple of years for the last couple of decades, basically. We've been on this steady path of improvement in official relations between the two countries. But polling data doesn't look the same. Polling data goes way more up and down, depending on circumstances, depending on events. And so there's some sort of mismatch there between what's going on in the official relationship and what's going on at the level of public perception. And I think that gap is something that, was actually tapped into during this last election cycle in terms of the way that Mexico played in the U.S. elections. And one thing we can say is that when policy and official relations are out of step with public opinion, or aren't in at least sort of lockstep with it, that leaves a certain amount of risk in the relationship, because it means that policies don't have a stable base of public support that they need to be long-term, safe, sort of foundational policies. Things like NAFTA, that are foundational and framework pieces of the U.S.-Mexico relationship, can be called into question and put at risk when they're not when official postures aren't matched by public opinion. And that's something that we've seen as a challenge, and I think we need to think about going forward in the U.S.-Mexico relationship, how we can do a better job of bringing the public along, explaining to the public the importance of regional cooperation. And there are reasons why it hasn't always happened, right? I mean, there are lots of reasons why that gap exists. But I think we can, to a certain extent, hold policymakers accountable for some of it, in the sense that in the United States, there's been a decision made several times for policymakers to because there's public skepticism around NAFTA, around certain trade issues, to not go deeper in terms of regional integration, but also to be a bit quiet about what's going on in terms of regional cooperation on economic issues. In Mexico, we could say maybe the same thing on security issues. While U.S.-Mexico security cooperation's deepened incredibly over the last decade, there's been somewhat of a reluctance on the part of Mexican leaders to talk about that to their public, to explain to them the importance of those issues, for fear of a nationalist backlash. Any of those decisions can be, easily explained and understood why policymakers might decide to be incremental and quiet at certain times and not bring things before the public and Congress all the time. But when that happens again and again and again over a long period of time, it can lead to this mismatch that I think has occurred in U.S.-Mexico relations. And so that's something that I think we should be thinking about for the long term going forward in U.S.-Mexico relations. As I mentioned before, one of the other things we see I guess I went ahead here. In this slide is this malleability of opinion, that there truly are ups and downs. Of course, some of that, is reflected in what I was just talking about, but the good side of that is that malleability means that there's an ability for thought leadership to matter, for recoveries to take place, and so when we see difficult periods in the relationship, we can also look for ways to recover from those difficult periods and not have to just believe that these are long-term losses in the relationship. The other, interesting thing here is just that U.S. perception of Mexico, when you just ask the question right now, is quite good. 64% positive is the most recent number that we had from this sort of combination of surveys that we were looking at. That's actually quite strong. It's a strong historical terms, and it's just a lot of the population. And so it's an interesting thing that despite some of the rhetoric that may be surprising, despite some of the rhetoric that we've heard over the last year and a half, that so many people in the United States have a positive opinion of Mexico. That said, when you ask people what they think about Mexico, just in an open format, their opinions are sort of led by negative ideas, challenges in the relationship, laced with stereotypes at times as well. And so there's, this bit of a complexity in terms of U.S. views of Mexico, where you have this, period of positive views in general, yet nonetheless these really persistent negative components of those views that show to a certain extent. I mean, some of these are very real challenges in Mexico, right? I mean, poverty, corruption, even drugs. I mean, those are real challenges in Mexico. But nonetheless, you see that these, there's a certain degree of long-held stereotypes or sort of a mismatch in terms of not an ability to see necessarily the entirety of Mexico, but a very simplistic view that ties into specific aspects of media coverage of Mexico. I'm going to try to just make a few points out of the data that we were looking at. First of all, these charts, I'm looking at youth opinion or age, segregated opinion here. The charts are flipped, so they actually are both showing a similar thing from the two perspectives. So basically what they both show, despite the fact that they look opposite, is that young people in both countries have a higher opinion of their neighbor than older generations in both countries. And so this is a really positive finding, right, is that young people are more open to their neighbor, have more positive feelings toward their neighbor. That should lead us to believe that we're in a position to make improvements over time as those generations move up, and also that there's maybe opportunities for the public and official relations to converge in terms of a long-term improvement in opinion. Of course, there's also a big risk there right now, which is that this is what you might term, the youngest generations, the youngest cohorts in these surveys are what you might term as a NAFTA generation, a generation of people that have grown up in a period where there hasn't been moments of significant acrimony, of significant clash between the United States and Mexico. And so right now is the first time in their lives that they're experiencing a moment like this. And so the real concern would be, what happens to this going forward? Or do we have a loss of a generation that was really the promising future for U.S. Mexico relations, or is this something that we can recover from? And I think the youth is an area in which we need to pay special attention, in which it deserves special focus in terms of the way that leaders in the relationship try to manage the long-term future of the relationship. Another trend that we see really clearly, I mean, the United States is polarizing politically. The United States is politically polarized. This is not, a new finding at all. It's been something that's been underway for several years. One important thing that I always feel the need to point out here is that this is not a Trump phenomenon. This is something that predates the election of Donald Trump or the campaign of Donald Trump. There's been, polarization on several issues, but several issues of importance to the U.S.-Mexico relationship as well. We see that the opinion of Democrats and Republicans on Mexico, which was once very similar, has over the years diverged. And Democrats are increasingly positive on their views of Mexico, and Republicans have not seen that same growth in terms of positivity. They're more ambivalent in terms of their views of Mexico. That also holds true on NAFTA. That also holds true on migration, holds true on some of these key topics in the relationship. And the point that I want to bring up here is just that Mexico itself is starting to look like a partisan issue in the United States. That has to be incredibly troubling for anyone who cares about the U.S.-Mexico relationship, because that takes away stability in the official relationship. If every swing of power in U.S. elections, in who's leading the U.S. government, means a swing in positive to negative relations between the two countries, we're not building up a long-term strategic partnership at that point. Now, that's not what we've necessarily seen yet, but I think we're seeing some concerning trends emerge in terms of the way that the public views and the public views themselves and the ways that they're being used for electoral purposes in the United States. And we should be very concerned about that, anyone who cares about the relationship. So I'm actually just going to stop there. I have a whole bunch of other stuff that we can pull into the discussion as we move forward, but I want to make sure we have time for discussion and for my colleagues to present some of their brand new findings. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Great way to introduce this. We're now going to move on to the new report from the Chicago Council, Wendy Laredo and ourselves. This is going to be sort of a joint presentation between Esteban Guzman and Craig Kafura. And so, I don't know how exactly you're going to work it out, which slides you're going to present, but I understand you've worked it out beforehand. So over to you guys.
So we're going to experiment with some good binational cooperation.
Yeah.
So as Duncan said, this is a sort of troika project. It's done by the Council on Global Affairs in Chicago, Buendia and Laredo, and with the generous support of the Mexico Institute here at the Wilson Center. And thanks to Duncan for hosting us today, and thank all of you for braving the cold. it's about the same temperature in Chicago, if you can believe it. All right. You want to kick it off?
Okay. So as Duncan was pointing out and Chris was pointing out, we all believe that the Mexico-U.S. relations right now are, especially in a rough patch and in a wrong place. So what we have seen in the last couple of years, or what our data is showing, that at least Mexicans' view of the United States, it's in like the lowest place ever. So I was checking like some trend lines that El País published from the 1950s, and they have like the Mexican-U.S. perception was around 57%, 60%. In the 70s, maybe it was around 45%. Right now, our polling data from October suggests that people in Mexico, they have an unfavorable views about the United States. 60% of Mexicans have 65% of Mexicans have a very unfavorable view of the United States. Among them, 40 have very unfavorable view about them, and 65 have a very unfavorable or somewhat unfavorable view about them. It's very different from what we saw in 2015 when people have a very favorable view or somewhat favorable view from the United States. Every two of three persons were having a very favorable view back then.
This is also a bit different than what I've seen in other countries' polling. All around the world, you've seen headlines about how other publics do not trust Trump to do the right thing in international affairs, but that generally hasn't affected views of the United States to the extent that you might expect. And we saw this during the Bush years, right? Bush was not a particularly popular person in Europe, but Europeans did not completely turn their backs on the United States. They didn't turn away from U.S. alliances, for example. This is something different, and I think it's because Trump has made it a much more personal, direct thing with Mexico.
And one of the other things that we would like to point out is that, as Chris was saying, younger generations have a more positive view about the United States. We've seen that people 18 to 29 years old, they slightly say that they have a better perception from the United States. We also see this in more educated people who have bachelor's degree or more also tend to have more positive views. We don't see very different stuff for people who have perceive themselves as priistas or panistas or periodistas. So in that sense, it's different from what happens in the United States. But we've seen in our data that younger generations are like having positive views about the United States. However, it's important to keep measuring what's going to happen because, as Chris was saying, this generation is at risk because they've never like confronted such a rough speech from the federal government, wall stuff, and we'll see what will happen in the next few years.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And of course, one of the problems that's driving this is the perception that the two countries are working in different directions on every issue that we asked about. And we asked about, narco trafficking, we asked about border security, trade and economic development. Even though they have fairly positive views on their trade relationship, neither public thinks that they're working in the same direction. In fact, I think it's 3/4 of Mexicans think that the U.S. and Mexico are working in different directions on trade. These are not the numbers you would necessarily want to see.
We have like 76% of Mexicans say that we're working in different directions for the securing the U.S. Mexico border. It's probably the same. It's roughly the same average as people saying that we're working in different directions in the trade and economic for trade and economic development. That happened in the same place for combating trafficking and illegal drugs and combating organized crime. So what's happening? It's kind of interesting because Mexicans have a more negative view in that sense as Americans. I think we've seen like kind of a counterintuitive shape of public opinion because probably like maybe 10 years ago, it was the other way around, how the U.S. and the Mexicans were thinking about how Mexico and the U.S. were working in the same direction. But now, probably we've seen this, now that Trump's been like 1 year as a president, that we've seen this, how this has changed.
And we'll see if this changes more in the future. If NAFTA renegotiations go well or go very poorly, I would expect these to change a bit. Now, for American views of Mexico, oh, you're a mind reader. So this looks a lot like the figure that Chris showed you. We use a slightly different way of measuring favorability toward countries. We use what's called a feeling thermometer, where you rate a country on a scale from 0 to 100. They've been pretty flat since the election, which is not what we expected. And this is very recent. This is from early December 2017. So this is about a year in from the election. Frankly, I expected opinion here to drop a bit, simply because when you have a president who talks about Mexico as much as Trump talks about Mexico, and in the way that he talks about Mexico, you'd expect that rhetoric to resonate a bit more. Instead, what we've seen is a further polarization of attitudes. If I were to put partisans on this chart, you'd see them, as in Chris's, slowly start to diverge. And that's something that we've seen on related issues as well. Democrats rate Mexico an average of 57 degrees, 6 points higher than the average. Republicans rate Mexico a slightly chilly 45, so 6 points under. This did not used to be the case. Back in the late 70s, early 80s, opinion of Mexico was not a partisan issue, and now it is becoming divided by party. As I'll show you later, this has also happened to an even stronger extent on views about immigrants and immigration.
So at least in Mexico, what we've seen is that policymaking is based a lot on public opinion. So what we've seen, what we see right now is that the Mexican views on international trade are quite good. So what Mexicans are expecting is that they don't want the country to close in terms of international trade. For example, we asked if Mexicans thought about if international trade was creating jobs. 77% of the Mexicans said that they are it's good for creating jobs. 69% tell us that international trade benefits consumers like them. 72% tells us that it's good for the Mexican economy. Right now, you all know that Mexico is having like upcoming elections. So if you see how candidates are like talking about like their different strategies or how they are trying to convince people, like none of them have like publicly said anything about international trade. It's probably because they don't know what's gonna happen. We're gonna talk about NAFTA later, but I just want to introduce this topic in the sense that Mexicans, at least right now, they want international trade to continue growing because they know that they have been like good for the economy. However, we're facing like kind of a difficult issue because there's like a left candidate who can be a populist that at in some sense it can like awake some nationalism that there's been in Mexico like for a while, and people could expect them to close the borders at some sense if NAFTA and international trade goes down.
And from the U.S. side, these numbers were very surprising when we saw them earlier in the year, because we, again, expected attitudes on trade to go down. We have a president who seem to be a big fan of these international trade deals. In response, public opinion shot up in favor of international trade. These numbers are up 10 to 15 points from where they were in 2016. They went up so much that we had to triple check the data because we were afraid we'd done something wrong. But it's also true across partisan lines. Democrats have, for several years now, had more favorable views of international trade than Republicans, including its effects on job creation and for consumers like them and on the U.S. economy. But even among Republicans, all of these items are now kind of in the green, so to speak. This is the highest favorability we've seen towards international trade in our data for a good decade.
So in Mexico, when trade deals became an important thing back in the 90s, everyone was skeptic about who were they going to benefit, right? So a lot of people, we had in 1994 when ZLN and the Zapatistas awake. And the problem was that, agriculture farmers were very worried because they were going to lose their jobs because of trade deals. We've seen like a very interesting shift of how people thinking about trade deals. We don't know yet if it's just because Trump and Mexicans want to continue with trade deals. But when we ask people if they think that Mexico and other countries benefit from trade deal, almost 6 out of 10 tell us that Mexico and other countries benefit from trade deals. Just 11% say that Mexico is the only country that benefits by themselves, and 21% believe that Mexico doesn't benefit from trade deals, but other people do.
And Americans are a little bit less thrilled with their trade deals than Mexicans, I think. But at the same time, half of them say that trade deals are mutually beneficial. This was a question we were trying to get at to test this theory of Trump appealing to this idea of Americans thinking that they're getting ripped off, that other countries are taking all the good stuff from trade deals. That doesn't seem to be the case. And that fits with what we've seen on views about international trade more generally. Americans think it's good for the economy, and they acknowledge that sometimes other countries benefit too, and that's not a bad thing.
And at the same time, thinking about globalization, what happens is pretty much what we saw in trade deals. If we have some figures from 2004 where people were not thinking about that globalization as a positive thing. You know, like Mexico was coming from the 80s and from the 90s from a different economic system. So people or Mexicans were not very willing to open. But right now, it's probably because, again, we've seen Trump, and it's probably like a backlash. What we've seen is that now we're more open for globalization because we think it's good for the economy. And it's interesting because if we compare it to Obama's years, we also have like 34% saying that globalization is not a good thing. So I think what this figure is telling us is that Mexico, in kind of a backlash, is thinking that globalization could be like a positive thing. So even if the U.S. decides to, close the borders and do not trade, the Mexicans, at least at this point, will be willing to continue cooperating with other countries.
And I think this is just sort of a third point of data from the U.S. side. Not only have Americans not turned their backs on trade deals specifically, but they haven't turned their backs on the idea of globalization in general. This is a question about the increasing connections of our economy with other countries around the world. I will note, though, this is another issue where the parties have started to drift apart a little bit. Democrats are now up in the 70s on favorability toward globalization. Republicans are not. They've been not falling down exactly, but staying flatter around the levels they were in the late 90s. And that's sort of an interesting trend to look at as we think about how the parties are coming apart, thinking about where they were coming from. And now the slide you've all been waiting for, NAFTA.
So yeah, right now, so what's going on with NAFTA? In 2004, Mexicans were saying that, less than a half of Mexicans were saying that NAFTA was good for the economy. Right now, they are saying 62% are saying that NAFTA is good for our economy. We didn't have this data before, but I can share them with you. We just asked the question to if Mexicans think that our government should stay on NAFTA or not. And also 60% are telling us that Mexico should stay in NAFTA. So if we go back to this idea that I was telling you before about the candidates, about the proposals of what they're gonna do, like pretty much we can expect that they want make policy issues based on continuing NAFTA. However, they don't have much to say about what Trump is gonna decide, if he's gonna exit NAFTA or not. So that's probably one of the reasons that they've been like kind of not talking much about it because they cannot do anything about it. But if policy making was based on public opinion, Mexicans in general think that the government should continue with NAFTA, and they also think that it's good for the economy.
Americans are a bit lower on NAFTA specifically when you compare it to all of the other measures on international trade and globalization that we've shown you. They're positive. They think it's good, barely, 53%. That's a quite a bit lower than they think about globalization more generally, which is in the 60s, or international trade, which is in the 70s. Part of that has to do with the partisan split when it comes to trade issues in Mexico. Republicans are much lower than Democrats on NAFTA, and that is going to be a bit of an issue since the Democratic Party is not currently running the government. At the same time, we have not seen a drop in support for NAFTA, despite a campaign where NAFTA was a fairly prominent topic in which candidates did not decide to stand up and wax eloquent about the benefits of NAFTA, but instead decided to talk about how they were going to get the good stuff from NAFTA and renegotiate it. And this was not a Trump phenomenon. Everyone decided that NAFTA was bad. Obama originally was going to go back to the table and get something better from NAFTA. At the same time, Americans are still standing by NAFTA. I'm still waiting for the bottom to drop out. It hasn't happened yet. Maybe the public is smarter than we're giving them credit for.
Can I just ask a quick question here?
Yeah.
This is mostly good. Oh, so this is the percent that's good, and then there's a percent that's bad, and is there a percent which is neither good nor bad?
No. So in the U.S. data, it's do you think it's mostly good or mostly bad? Okay. And this is the percent mostly good. Okay. You can also say you don't know, and a few percent always do.
So, so even though that Mexicans are thinking that NAFTA is good for the economy, they see very differently the partners. So, for example, I mean, we've seen this before. Mexicans think that Canada, for example, it's they practice fair trade with us. In contrast, Mexicans believe that the United States practice on fair trade with us. Almost, well, 75% of the Mexicans are saying that the U.S. practice on fair trade with us. That will be very different from what Mr. President Trump think. In the same sense, Mexico has been talking that if the United States decide to withdraw from NAFTA, they will be willing to continue cooperating with other countries. So perceptions about the, for example, European Union or China, Mexicans do believe that they can practice or they do practice trade or good. They have good practice trade with us.
And we're sort of seeing the same thing on the U.S. side. Although Americans are pretty fond of Canada, they feel very warmly toward Canada. In other questions, they think that Canada is a fair trading partner. They're divided on whether or not Mexico is a fair trading partner. They're much less favorable toward China on this issue, which makes sense if you've heard the rhetoric about Chinese trading practices toward the U.S. That does make it a little bit tricky for NAFTA talks, obviously. And again, there are partisan divisions on Mexico as a fair trading partner. Republicans are much less likely to say that Mexico is a fair trading partner of the U.S., and Democrats are much more likely to say that it is. This is, again, part of what Chris talked about, the increasing degree to which issues relating to Mexico and the U.S. Mexico relationship are dividing along partisan lines among the public, which is not something that we've historically seen. This is a new phenomenon, probably over the last decade or so. And then, so I have two slides. These are just U.S. opinion, but I thought they were relevant and interesting, especially given the debate about DACA that's going on right now. I mentioned earlier that the parties had moved apart on immigration issues. This is a question asking about whether or not large numbers of immigrants and refugees coming to the U.S. represent a critical threat to the United States. Republicans basically have not budged on this issue in 20 years. Democrats, on the other hand, are vastly less concerned than they were in the late 90s. In the late 90s, this was a bipartisan issue of concern. And now they are 41 points apart. This is one of the largest divides in the survey data that we get in the US. The only thing that's like it is climate change. And because Democrats have fallen off so sharply, overall concern has trended down a lot. But that's also masking the stability of Republican concern on this issue. And that carries over into views about providing a path to citizenship for unauthorized immigrants in the US. For DACA specifically, the numbers are much more bipartisan. Between 70 and 90% of partisan groups favor a DACA program, depending on how exactly you describe it. But simply for providing a path to legal status, there's a fair amount of support. 7 in 10 Democrats, about half of Republicans. And I'll also point out in this graph, we think of these sort of core Trump supporters, and I'm calling those people those who have a very favorable view of Donald Trump. We think of them as being very staunchly anti-immigrant. Only 45% of them said that undocumented immigrants should be forced to leave the country. I expected that number to be quite a bit higher. This has been obviously a key issue of his campaign. That said, if you spell out the policy options, and I think these are all reasonably realistic, a majority of them do not support forced deportation.
Before I guess that before we open like the talk like to questions about for the public, just like as a wrap up, I think that Mexico right now is facing like a lot of issues, like domestic issues, international issues. So Jorge Castañeda, who was a foreign minister in 2003, was saying that there could be like conditions for a perfect storm, right? So one of them could be the United States tax reform. The second one could be the NAFTA, the end of NAFTA, and the third one will be our presidential election. So right now, in terms of public opinion, if you ask people, at least in general, they don't think that NAFTA would be like a top of mind problem. Then when you start like asking a little bit more, they could say like economy, and then they start relating NAFTA on other stuff. But what Mexicans, for example, are very opinionated about, they know what's happening. For example, what's the current status of the Mexican peso vis-a-vis the US dollar. So that could be like one of the important drivers, during the election. If the United States decide to drop out of NAFTA during the current campaign, that will pretty much affect everyone in Mexico, and that could be it could likely affect the results. Or like a Trump tweet during the election could really impact what's going to happen. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen in the end, but it could be like, conditions for very difficult situation for the Mexican internally, but also for the U.S. Mexican relations. Because, I mean, again, if we go back to Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, who's been like the candidate who's more openly against or going back to protectionism, there's like kind of a risk, going back to an economic system that he has like publicly said that he prefers.
Great. Gentlemen, thank you very much. And let me just say, after mentioning or thanking the gentleman, Dina Smeltz was, of course, supposed to be here with us today, but unfortunately, she got ill and so wasn't able to make the journey. We're delighted to have you, Craig, of course. But Dina, if you're watching, listening, then we miss you, and please get well soon. I have a couple of questions I'd like to pose to the panelists before we open it up for Q&A from the public. The first one is for Chris, and I know the answer to this, but I want you to share it with the audience. Esteban and Craig talked about the partisan split in the United States. I wonder if you could comment, give some details about the partisan split or not in Mexico.
Sure, and I think Esteban mentioned it a little bit as well. There just isn't one. That's what's remarkable on some of these key issues. I mean, we have data that from Pew that they shared with us that they haven't made public yet. On both views of the United States from Mexico and on views of NAFTA in Mexico. And if you look at the parties, we have PRD, PRI, PAN, Morena data. There's just, the differences are a matter of a few points here and there, and they're not necessarily in any clear direction that you would expect to find it in even. Folks from Morena actually tend to be a little bit more positive towards the United States in these findings. Now, whether that's beyond sort of margin of error and stuff like that, I'm not entirely sure. But the point that needs to be made is just that you don't see it. There's just not a clear partisan split on these issues. And I think that there's a lot of talk about how the United States, how NAFTA may play in the elections in Mexico, how that may lead to policy changes in Mexico depending on the outcomes of the elections. If just based on this, just based on this data, you shouldn't expect that to be a really big problem. Because there's not a big partisan split, because there's not any partisan split on the issue of the United States or of NAFTA in Mexico, it doesn't lend itself to be an issue that's manipulated by the candidates, that's used by the candidates to drive wedges between different blocks of voters and that kind of a thing. It's just not something that I don't want to say, I mean, Esteban mentioned that, depending on what happens in the United States, NAFTA could play in the elections in Mexico. I think that's right. Obviously, it's an important issue for Mexicans. It's an issue that hits pocketbook issues pretty quickly, and so the salience of it could go up. But you're not going to see the candidates land on vastly different sides of the issue because Mexicans don't land on vastly different sides of the issue. And the same can be said with the United States in general. Everyone in Mexico is concerned about the future of the U.S. Mexico relationship, but they all see a value in partnership with the United States. And that was another thing that we found in our survey that I found really interesting, or in a survey actually that Pablo did with us last year, was that even as Mexican views on the United States declined, the view that Mexicans and Americans needed to work together on joint issues, on issues of mutual concern, stayed very high. So there's this pragmatism that Mexico and the United States are linked together. There are issues that affect us jointly, and we need to continue working together on those, even if we have challenges in the relationship, even if Mexicans, feel like Americans don't like them or the president doesn't like them, they still have a sense that we need to work together. And so I think that actually, provides a sense of stability and resilience from the Mexican side of the relationship right now.
Let me just reinforce those 2 points. I think it's really important. The first one is that Mexicans tend not to vote on foreign policy issues. They tend to vote on largely domestic issues. So even if they do have an unfavorable view of the United States, it's probably not going to figure in their electoral choices. And the second one is that, even amongst those people who are in Mexico who are deeply worried about the state of relations right now, they all recognize that, in fact, in the long term, we are bound together as two countries. And they recognize that cooperation will go on in multiple areas, with or without NAFTA, despite a lot of the conversations that have been happening both here in Washington and in Mexico City about whether security cooperation would continue. A lot of most people recognize, they say, well, it's inescapable. We probably have to keep working together. For Esteban and Craig, I wanted to talk about, Chris at the beginning talked about how personalities obviously make a big difference in the relationship. And I wanted to ask you both whether it's personalities or is it economic trends that are more important, or is there something else that's underlying this? Because, we're bombarded with the positive economic data in the United States right now. Does that play in, presumably, to the improving views on immigration, on international trade, et cetera, or is it more about personalities in politics? What have you seen?
So on the U.S. side, I think one of the important things to think about, especially when you're looking at these partisan trends, is changing party compositions demographically. So one of the big changes in the Democratic Party, obviously, is the fact that it is much less white than it used to be 20 years ago. That has big implications for views on economic issues, where you see minority voters tending to be more liberal on economics, but it also matters for issues like immigration. When you have a greater proportion of the party being Hispanic, or maybe knowing someone who's from Mexico or in Mexico, that matters for immigration policy. It matters for trade policy with Mexico. Also, they're a younger party. And as I think Chris was talking about, you do see big age gaps on some of these issues relating to Mexico, where younger Americans, this NAFTA generation, is more positive toward Mexico, toward trade relations. Some of it is going to be about personality. Obviously, I don't think you would have the same state of relations if we had a different president, even a different president from the same party. President Pence would not be in this position, but President Pence would also probably not be trying to renegotiate NAFTA in quite the same way. I don't know, Esteban, how do you think about this?
Okay, so before I answer that question, I only want to add something about like this partisanship thing. So I think that one of the challenges that López Obrador faces right now is that a lot of his voting also has to do with young people, and young people also in Mexico City. So that's one of the reasons that when you see like Morena could be like more favorable about NAFTA, about trade deals, could be this, like these younger generations that they are aware, they do believe in López Obrador, but at the same time, they have like positive views on the United States. So that's one of the reasons that it's not very easy like for López Obrador to say, okay, so now we're gonna close relationship with the United States, we're gonna end up NAFTA, because one big deal of these people are like young people who we've seen that they openly support NAFTA and support the United States. In the other sense, answering what Duncan was saying, I think that on Mexicans' view, it could be like more about the personality traits. I mean, we've openly seen a president who has been attacking Mexicans, like bad hombres, and saying that they are gonna build a wall. So even though that, in the United States, like the economy is booming, the Dow Jones is have like, like having all-time records, in Mexico, like perception is different. So what's gonna happen in the end is that even though that the United States continue, like, having a good economy and NAFTA doesn't end, and, in consequence, the Mexican economy does grow, it doesn't seem that if the Mr. President Trump attitude changes, there's gonna be like a shift in public opinion in the short term. So probably if like the speech doesn't change much, it's gonna be like the same way like for the rest of Trump's presidency, and we will see how much it will take for relationships to recover, like the Mexican-U.S. relationship recover. So yeah, in Mexico, of course, we're very interested in the economic part, but like there's a sense of what we are feeling in public opinion is like the Mexicans are like feeling like hurt from the United States. Just like to finish this point, it's very important, like, to recognize there was like a Parametia survey where they were asking if they had like positive views of Americans and from the American government. So it's quite different. Actually, like, Mexicans don't. It's not that they have like a bad opinion about Americans, but it's just more about the American government. So that's, I mean, I think that's good news.
Absolutely. Thank you. Let's open it up for questions and answers. Who would like to lead off? Who's the most curious person here? Take that how you will. Dolia, introduce yourself, please.
Yes,
Not that you need any introduction, but
thank you.
let's do it.
I'm Dolia Esteves. I'm a reporter, journalist.
I'm not sure the microphone's on. Yes. There you go. No. Yeah, beautiful.
I just have a simple question because you refer that the U.S. Mexico relations, especially Esteban, need to be recovered. What I see here is that U.S. Mexico relations at the government level are excellent. We see Mr. Videgaray come here once a week, or no, once a month. I don't know if he comes once a week, but at least once a month in average since the Trump administration took over. And they're negotiating NAFTA. There's bumps and so forth, but the negotiations continue against many odds. So I don't see how you can say the relationship needs to be recovered. I think that despite the personality and the attacks and all the things that Trump says about Mexicans, he has stopped saying anything about the government or Peña Nieto lately. So can you elaborate why you say that one thing is the relationship between the two governments and another thing is the perception of the people, seems to me. So let's clarify that, because I don't agree that the relationship needs to be recovered. I think it's an excellent state, and they say it. Both governments say it, that the relationship has never been this close in certain things. They still have an ambassador over there that doesn't really represent Trump, but that she's loved more than any other ambassador the U.S. has had. Of course, it was named by Obama, but she's still there, as opposed to the ambassador in Panama. So anyway, if you could elaborate on that.
Thank you. It's an important distinction. Anybody else would like to jump in at this point in time? Yes, please, Kevin. Microphone's coming. Right.
Thank you. Kevin Middlebrook, University College London and the Wilson Center. I'm going to follow up on, I think, mainly Craig's comments, but particularly with reference to Figure 22 and the partisan split over NAFTA, because you talked about demographic changes within the Republican and Democratic parties, but in a 4-year period, 2013 to 2017, there's a 10 percentage point shift, and I'm just curious what explains why Republicans are more critical of NAFTA than Democrats would be, unless the Republicans have in fact captured the American working class.
Okay. A third question, or should we just... yes, please, Patricia.
Hi, Patricia Scamilla-Ham.
Microphone.
Thank you. Patricia Scamilla-Ham, and I'm a specialist on U.S. Mexico security issues. My question is about the status of Mexico in relation to the U.S., the image, and of course the implications of that image. It seems to me like one thing that has been cleared by your the public opinion polls and just what is happening right now. President Trump has made it very clear that Mexico is in a subordinate position that we all know, it is, of course, but it has become more clear and more concrete on the opinion of Americans and the U.S. In other words, the U.S. can still manipulate Mexico into, rushing to try to make the Trump happy, about the negotiations of NAFTA and so forth. But the point, and the wall, of course, kind of playing with the question of the wall. And Duncan said something that's important. He said that he heard opinions in Mexico that this was going to have a long impact. Chris said something that I understood differently, that it could be, a public opinion was malleable, and it could go rebound and be fine again. Now, how does the image of a country, the prestige as an independent sovereign nation, bounce back and forth so easily? Probably I'm not clear, but my concern is that it has become very clear in the U.S. and in Mexico that Mexico is kind of at the mercy of the U.S. in at least in trade issues and security issues. How can we make up for that?
Thank you. Okay, who would like to lead off in the responses?
Okay, so maybe I can start with your question. Yeah, of course, it's a great distinction that we have to do. So I'm referring to public opinion, which we do believe that it's very important in the sense that, maybe a lot of policy making is based on public opinion. So we're not saying that the U.S. and Mexico are not cooperating together. I mean, it's a good thing that, the government officials are still cooperating and they're willing to renegotiate NAFTA. Like Paul Ryan was saying just last week, that they would prefer to renegotiate NAFTA before exiting it. So it's a good distinction, but at the same time, I think that back in Mexico and back in Washington, I do believe that there's this public opinion where there's not a lot of dialogue. So maybe there's officials who are working together, but in the sense, at least from Mexicans' views, they are feeling that there's a president that is unwilling to cooperate with the government because there's some kind of resentment against Mexicans. So that's where Mexicans and the U.S. relations have to work together, to change how people are feeling about this.
Can I jump in on that one too? I mean, I don't think that it's too much to say that the U.S.-Mexico relationship's at risk right now at all. If we think of sort of what the big baskets are of the U.S.-Mexico relationship, it's economic issues, including trade, migration, and security. Security cooperation is continuing pretty well right now, but I've definitely heard plenty of concerns that the tone of relations is putting some of that cooperation at risk in the future. On migration, Mexican citizens in the United States facing loss of DACA protections, deportations from different tactics of ICE, different policies in that sense at state levels as well, are certainly at risk. There's a lot that's still to be decided in that basket of issues, but there's certainly a significant level of risk there. I mean, DACA itself has already been terminated. Protection of Mexican citizens in the United States has always been one of the core interests of Mexico in the relationship with the United States. And then trade. I mean, NAFTA is the foundation of trade of the foundational framework for trade between the United States and Mexico for the economic relationship. And that's at risk right now. It's not gone. So absolutely, there's still a lot to be determined in the relationship, but it's at risk in a way that it wasn't, a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. It's at risk for the first time since it was created. And so that's absolutely a challenge in the relationship. There are massive challenges in the U.S.-Mexico relationship right now that have not been in place previously. There's also a lot still to be determined in the relationship. So I think that it's fair to say that it's more than simply matters of perception that are at play right now.
Let me just to back that up, and it's anecdotal evidence, but halfway through last year, I was down in Mexico City, had a meeting with a lot of folks, and 3 cabinet officials all said to me the same thing. When I said, "So how do you see the bilateral relations?" They said, "Surprisingly good, actually. It's going very, very well, and you can say that the frequency of visits and the contact, it's incredible how well it's going, but we're all waiting for the next tweet." And of course, the timing of the tweet matters a great deal, and particularly as we're now firmly in the electoral cycle in Mexico. We're in pre-campaña, but let's face it, the campaign is firmly underway, and people are nervous about what's going to come out of the United States and what resonance that will have in Mexico. And so I think that's where people see it. So Chris's term "at risk" is a good one. because people are on edge and they're waiting to see, and they want to know how they can actually manage communications from the White House so that they cause as little damage as possible.
Well, they're paying less attention to the tweets lately. I mean, they
Yep.
were reacting a lot in the beginning, but it seems like they learned to live with it.
Exactly. Now, question from Kevin on
Yes,
the partisan split.
on the partisan split on NAFTA. So part of this is, I think, a reaction to their party's leader talking a lot about NAFTA, especially the change between 2013 and 2017. Some of it is demographics, but I would keep in mind that the working class is not mostly white. The working class is, if you're talking about just in terms of income, they tend to be non-white, they tend to be Democratic. What you have seen is the Republican Party becoming older and whiter, or, sorry, older and as white as they have traditionally been. That does, when we think about kind of the white working class, we think about, I think the image that comes to mind is often, 50, 55-year-old mill worker in Ohio. There have been partisan changes among the white working class, but the working class more broadly is a pretty diverse group. If you want very, very specific data, talk to me afterwards. I have my laptop. I can run it all for you.
And just one thing to throw in there is there's also some regional differences that we see. And it is the, sort of as you would expect and as we saw during this last election cycle in terms of which states were won by President Trump that we might not have expected a Republican to win. It's this upper Midwest, Rust Belt area of the country where we're seeing more of this split occurring, more of the skepticism around trade occurring than some of the other places in the country. And interestingly, on immigration as well, because it's not necessarily the part of the country that receives the most immigrants, right? So we're seeing more anti-immigrant sentiment in places that receive fewer immigrants than vice versa.
Yeah, there's been a lot of research on what causes hostility to immigrant groups, and there doesn't seem to, it's not concentrated in the areas where they arrive, but the areas next to those. Some very good academic papers if you want references. I would also say, specifically in the Midwest as a region and on trade issues, this is also where you're starting to see pushback to the administration when he goes out and he talks to farm state senators, and none of those people say, yes, you should pull out of NAFTA. It does give him pause because when those people go back to their home states, the farmers are concerned. They know that if NAFTA goes under, that where am I going to sell my corn? Where am I going to sell my soybeans? Where am I going to sell my dairy? These are real, very serious issues.
Right. Now, Patricia's question about the malleability of public opinion, how does it bounce back? Chris, you led off with that, so why don't you begin the responses?
Sure. I'm not sure I totally got the entirety of the question. I mean, I think that the answer on the malleability portion on the recovery is that we don't know, right? I mean, we're still, very early on into this period of a huge decline in opinion, and we've yet to see a real bounce back, but we don't have a ton of good information to measure that because we don't have enough consistency in polling. It's been different companies that are asking questions in different ways. So we'll learn a lot more in the next year, 2 years, 3 years as to what the recovery might look like. From the perspective of Mexico, I mean, I guess I in a very broad sense, I take issue with the notion that Mexico is the sort of way to characterize the U.S. Mexico relationship as one of dominance and subordinance. I think that we've seen over time that Mexico on many issues is the one that leads in terms of deciding what's possible. Security cooperation has certainly been one of those areas in which it's really up to Mexico to determine how much, how deep that security cooperation is going. Of course, the United States, there's an asymmetry in the relationship, though, at the same time. And so it's this interesting dance between levels of sort of power on different issues and ability to influence. But what's, I think interesting within that context is just, again, that stability and broad-based support for all of these things that matter in the U.S.-Mexico relationship within Mexico. That really provides a level of resilience, stability, and I think long-term support that's we're worried about eroding in the United States. So they're really, the U.S. and Mexico in very different places right now in terms of the relationship at the public level.
And it's a bit hard for me to talk about the malleability bouncing back from this, because this is a bit different than other instances where attitudes have soured on a relationship, where normally what you see is reactions just to the leader of the country. Again, we saw this with Bush in European attitudes. Europeans were very negative on the U.S. president. That said, they didn't sour on the U.S. This is different. This seems to be not just a souring on the U.S. president, but a souring on the U.S., on the country, but not the people necessarily. So there's still a little bit of a bright spot there.
But that's why I also think that, I think that's an important distinction, and it really makes me feel like there's still a lot to decide in the future, right? Is because if, NAFTA's at risk, but if NAFTA recovers, I mean, if we have a NAFTA 2.0 that's better than the first NAFTA, well, then it didn't turn into a policy with long-term implications. Then it really stayed at that level of personality. It depends on what happens on migration as well. I mean, I think that there's a huge amount of concern. There was a feeling of being insulted, but that's very much linked to personality and the president that was elected in the United States. And how those, personality things, how those risks get codified into policy or not, will ultimately, I think, go a long way in determining the amount of recovery and the speed of recovery that can happen in terms of public opinion.
And the public can hold kind of multiple views about a country in their head at once. So we saw this actually with views of Japan through the 70s up through the 90s, where the views of Japan as a country and their favorability were fairly high, and their views as a trading partner were very negative. But the two did not clash in the same direct way. We could also have that with Mexico. Views of Mexico as a trading partner could stay low, and recovery and favorability could go up.
And just to point out, of course, there's a lot of malleability, and there's a lot of very interesting research about malleability in public opinion. But that's one of the reasons that it's not necessarily a good idea to make public policy based on public opinion. So probably we would have made a poll in 1994, Mexicans would have said that NAFTA was a bad thing. So the thing is that now 14 years after, Mexicans realized that it was positive for the economy. So, if Mexican leadership and the government would have decided not to enter NAFTA just because of public opinion, it would have been probably a bad idea, right? So, yeah, of course, there's malleability, and we'll have to see what happens in the next few years, and regarding how Mexicans are viewing the U.S. relationship. But yeah, I think that policymakers have to be very careful about taking decisions just based on public opinion.
One of the most interesting things I've seen over the past year, and I've been saying it pretty much every presentation that we've given, is that the attack on Mexico and the attack on NAFTA from the executive branch here has resulted in people becoming more aware of Mexico's importance to the United States, getting a better understanding of why Mexico matters to the United States. And I think that's partly reflected in some of the data on the U.S. side. So I've been using the term Trump's good for business because he's really good for the Mexico Institute, because more people visit our website, more people read our publications, more people are willing to fund us and keep the money coming, please, all of you out there are watching on the webcast. And I think that this is one of the things that we're seeing, particularly in the farm states, that we're seeing that people who never thought about Mexico before are actually beginning to understand why the bilateral relationship matters. And so in a perverse kind of way, long-term, Trump may actually result in long-term favorability towards Mexico, just simply because of you're putting things at risk at this point in time. Who knows? It's a fingers crossed kind of thing on my part. Let's hope it turns out that way. We have time for another round of questions. Mark, microphone's coming down.
Hi, Mark Fierstein. I wear multiple hats, but I'll comment on my role with GBA Strategies with the polling firm. We've been doing a lot of polls and focus groups in Mexico. So I agree with this, Esteban, that on the one hand, a tweet could ultimately, or a series of tweets could ultimately impact the Mexican election, and perhaps we saw the tweets this morning. I'm not sure if you had a chance to see those. But I'm struck, and I agree with Duncan and Christopher, that so far, Trump doesn't seem to be really having an impact on how people are perceiving the candidates and expressing their intention to vote. And when we do focus groups, for example, Trump's name never comes up. I mean, obviously we probe on him, and you get the predictable responses, very, very negative. They call him dangerous and a jerk and stronger language, racist, what have you, the kind of things you hear in this country too. But unprompted, it rarely comes up. And what's really driving, I think, AMLO's support is fairly predictable. It's discussed with corruption, frustration with the economy, concern about crime, et cetera. So really more of a comment than a question, but would welcome your comments on that too.
Thank you. Let's throw a hand up over here.
Does it work? I'm Nadia Pembridge. I'm a bilateral relation enthusiast. So thinking in terms of leadership and the fact that the relationship will continue to thrive and grow, and we can't change that. And also considering public policy is not guided necessarily by public opinion, what would be 2 or 3 recommendations you would have for, in terms of for public officials, in terms of public diplomacy, and maybe providing information to build on citizens' understanding of the issues to make the relationship grow?
Thank you. And then there was a hand up here. Yeah.
Hi, 2 quick questions. First, could you maybe talk about the methodology of your poll, sample size, any geographic oversampling, and on both sides? And second, looking at figure 5, sort of the aggregate poll of American favorability toward Mexico, it strikes me that favorability seems to be higher during Republican administrations than Democratic administrations, which seems to run counter to the partisan breakdown of views toward immigration. So it seems a little bit counterintuitive to me, so I'm wondering if you could comment on that. Thank you.
Sorry, could you introduce yourself as well?
Oh, sorry, Jeff Phillips from the Annenberg Foundation Trust at Sunnylands.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks.
Okay, 3 excellent questions.
Go ahead if you want. Ready?
Methods. So, sorry, I didn't show this earlier because I thought people might be a little bit bored with methodology slides. So from the U.S. side, this is based on 3 different polls. Most of the data is from the annual 2017 Chicago Council survey, which was conducted this summer. Last summer. It's 2018 now. National sample of 2,020 adults, all 50 states, 18 and older. They were all fielded through GFK, either through GFK Custom Research or the GFK OmniWeb. Both use their knowledge panel. If you want to talk about exactly how they get their panel, I'm happy to talk about it afterwards. Third sample in there is the Omnibus. That's from December 1st through 3rd, 2017. That's the 1,000-person sample. And there's one item in this report from 2016, also from the 2016 Chicago Council survey, 2,061 adults.
So for the Mexican side, first, I'm thrilled that you asked for the methodology. I'm a survey methodologist, so I mean it's really good. Like people when ask things about methodology. So in Mexico, it was a face-to-face survey. Actually, like in the U.S., they usually surprise themselves when we say that we conduct face-to-face surveys. A good thing in Mexico is that it's relatively cheap to conduct face-to-face surveys. So the good thing is in here that we are not expecting a lot of bias, right? I mean, it would have been very different if we have just doing a survey for urban areas or rural areas. So yeah, it's a face-to-face survey that was conducted by the beginning of October. It's the sample. It's 1,000 interviewers. So we use lista nominal from INE. That it's all public data. We just for weighting data. It's data from INEGI. We just a raking method. I think that's all the methodology. So that's the figures from Buendia y Laredo. That's the 2017 survey. So that's all the figures that you saw.
Was it in Mexico City or?
No. It's national. It's
all the states?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a representative sample. So I mean, I'm not sure if we touch all the states, but you usually would see in a national sample that you will go to about 27, 28 states from the 32. So, I mean, it depends. It depends at the end of the national sample because it's probabilistically. So, how many interviews? 1,000. Yeah. So, the sample margin of error will be 3.5 or something like that. Okay, so go. It's everyone. It's pretty much everyone. So that's the thing. With a face-to-face survey, you go and interview everyone. So that's why we can like talk about like different ages. Like we can make cuts of urban, rural, people from who have bachelor's degrees. So we made this crossed up to see if there was like any differences in like favorable and unfavorable views about the states. So yeah. We're covering pretty much everyone, and then we do weighting, like like for adjust. I mean, it's usually like, for example, when you do a national survey, maybe you overrepresent a little bit, like women, older women who are more in their house, and we usually tend like to find less young adults like working, right? But yeah, that's the reason that we weight the survey. So going back to the comment about polls and focus groups. So at the beginning of the year, I mean, it was like we were not doing like focus groups like specifically about Trump, but it was very interesting because when Trump started, actually, as a president, we've seen in focus groups that people were really concerned about it. It's like, okay, so maybe Mexicans were really concerned because they didn't know what's gonna happen. They were building a wall, and like the media were very attractive, and like Trump was very pointed out in media. I mean, it's still pointed out, but I think it's been like little by little, like people are not at least in Mexico, they are more skeptical about the tweet. So they have been, at the end, I think they've understand that one thing is what he's tweeting, and one thing it's like how relationships are going. So right now, I mean, if you conduct a focus group or if you do polls, you could notice, you could really notice that Mexicans now are thinking about another thing. I mean, at the beginning of the year, they were like really concerned about Trump's presidency, about what's gonna happen, like in Mexico and all over the all around the world. Now the Mexican perception, it seems to be quite different. At least it's not like the top of mind problem, Trump. So yeah, we've seen this like throughout the year. It has changed a lot, both in polls and focus groups. So that's kind of very, very interesting. In terms of public policy, I mean, I think that the best recommendation that people could do is like just let Mr. President Trump do his tweets, but at the end officials continue working together, right? So it's like, okay, he can, last week, Paul Ryan was saying that he wanted like to continue with NAFTA, that he will prefer to renegotiate instead of exiting, right? So then we had like yesterday, I think it was Sonny Perdue who said that NAFTA was benefiting farmers. General Motors was saying that like they know that they are pushing for NAFTA to continue. So no, there's just like like Washington and like all the federal government should have like to focus still like in good relationship, and not worry much about like how much Trump is tweeting, and that's a good thing. Like at the same time, of course, it's very difficult not to pay attention to what he's saying or what he's not commenting, and we've seen that like last week when it was not Trump effectively, but markets were like up and down like last week, like crazy, because some people were expecting that NAFTA was going to end, and there was like some rumors that maybe in the State of the Union NAFTA Mr. Trump will present or will withdraw with NAFTA. So I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty, but at the end, well, like the best advice, I guess, is like like officials from both Mexico and the United States, and of course Canada, continue working. And I think that was it.
Great. So, Marina, can you pull up from my presentation the second slide? I'm going to come to that in just a second. But first, let me answer the question about the policies, because we found some interesting things as we were looking through polling data and some other research that offers some hints as to directions that officials could take and that leaders in the bilateral relationship could take to try to address some of the challenges we saw. One, of course, is what I said before, which is a focus on youth, right? We have this tremendous opportunity in the youth because of their natural inclination to have a better view of their neighbors, but it's at risk, so it deserves attention, right? So a focus on young people right now, and there are multiple ways to do that, of course, but one thing that connects that to another finding that we had, which is that people that are closer to the bilateral relationship tend to have better views of their neighbor as well. People that live closer to the border in general, there's one finding recently that kind of goes contrary to that, but in general, I still believe it to be true from both sides of the border, that those who live closer to the border tend to have better views of each other. Those who have traveled, and we didn't find this so much specifically in U.S. Mexico relations, but a general finding is that people who travel to countries tend to have better views of that country. So experience in a country matters, things like that. That those, so if those who have more experience in a country tend to have better views of it, and if youth is an area that's warranting focus, well, student exchange seems to be a really good opportunity to strengthen the relationship for the long term, because this is something that addresses that generation. And student exchange in particular is something that there's very strong research showing the importance of it in terms of driving. It's because what it is that the research on travel is mixed. Sometimes travel can be too superficial to have a strong, lasting impact on the way one understands and views another country. But if you find a way to add a little bit of depth to that experience in travel, and there are lots of ways that have been tried to do that, even such simple things as like handing out pamphlets that give people a little more background on the country that they're traveling to, actually has proven in certain studies to have an impact. But certainly student exchange is a much deeper form of travel and does have a really important impact. I would also say, though, that we should think about the fact that Mexico and the United States are the largest tourist destinations for each of the travelers from those countries. So we have this travel that's taking place that may be superficial in certain cases, that we can try to think creatively about ways to add depth to add an educational component to, so that it does translate into a deeper level of knowledge and understanding that can change opinions for the longer term. Third thing I would say is that policy matters. So the impact, we've talked about it already, but the outcome on NAFTA will matter for the future of public opinion in the bilateral relationship. The outcome on certain immigration decisions will have an impact on the outcome on the long-term public opinion in the bilateral relationship. So those things also deserve a big amount of focus. And then I think there needs to be some targeted reaction to this developing problem of Mexico becoming a partisan issue in the United States. It needs to be addressed. And I think there may be lots of different ways you could think about trying to tackle that, but I think that Mexico and the Mexican government needs to design a strategy to do better outreach to specific populations that are not hearing messages about, these types of positive messages about Mexico. One of the reasons, and there are again many, that this fragmentation, this polarization is occurring it's at least linked to media fragmentation in certain ways. And what that means is that you can't just count on, what you'd sort of maybe term the mainstream media as being sufficient to get your message out to lots of different populations and some of the specific ones that need to be targeted. So there needs to be, in my opinion, a targeted strategy to get a message about Mexico, add complexity to understanding about Mexico to groups that might not be in places where they're receiving that type of information right now. And then on this one, and sort of whether, the Republican, I guess the point you were making is that it looks like, during Republican, stay back on that first slide that you're on, that it looks like during Republican administrations, U.S. perception of Mexico is better. I think it's looking at it backwards in some ways, because I think what drives U.S. opinion on Mexico is not who the U.S. president is. That may drive Mexican opinion of the U.S., but this is U.S. opinion of Mexico, and so what drives that is what's going on in Mexico, more so than, I'm not trying to say it has no impact. But so what I would look at, what I see here, and there's some, space for discussion and argument about exactly what drives all the movements there, is that the economic crisis in Mexico in the 90s had a negative impact on U.S. views of Mexico. That democratization in Mexico, the election of a non-pre president for the first time, had a very positive impact on U.S. opinion of Mexico, and that the rising tide of organized crime-related violence in Mexico had a negative impact. There's a recovery underway now, and an interesting recovery underway, because there's also a resurgence of violence in Mexico. So where that heads in the future, I think, is an interesting question, and the way that the media is covering violence this time around versus the last wave of violence is an interesting thing to look at in that context as well. But my overall point would just be that, I think that this is driven much more by what's going on in Mexico than what's going on in U.S. politics.
And I would add to that, there may also be some timing effects going on. One of the interesting and fun things about doing public opinion research, especially archival, is that people tend to ask questions about issues that are being covered prominently in the news, which means that sometimes you get some bounce around effects. If you're asking questions, right after, a major peso crash, then yes, suddenly Americans' views of Mexico will be quite different. It's interesting to compare this to the Council's trend on attitudes on Mexico, which are always conducted roughly at the same time, and it's much flatter. And it looks, in that slide, views don't change much between 1978 and 1998. They're pretty flat. I'll add 2 points on your travel. So in 2013, we did a survey on U.S. Mexico relations and asked, have you been to Mexico? Half of Americans said that they had been to Mexico at some point in their lives. And we tracked down some other sources that corroborated that, other polls about travel to Mexico. So there is a huge personal component of this. And yes, other governments have experimented with ways of doing these kind of person-to-person exchanges. A big one for Japan has been the JET program, the Japan English Teaching Program, which came in very handy after the 2011 earthquake, tsunami, meltdown, triple disaster. The JET alumni network was a huge part of relief efforts and raising awareness, and the Japanese government sees those alumni as a crucial base of support for the U.S.-Japan relationship in the U.S. I don't know if Mexico has tried something similar, but it would be worth considering.
Absolutely.
College graduates are cheap.
It's a good point, and unfortunately Dan Restrepo, who was here earlier on from CAP, he had to leave, but CAP is organizing these young leaders tours to Mexico. And it's very, very important. They're trying to bring in people from across the political spectrum, demographic spectrum, and taking them down to Mexico to try to increase an understanding. And all those things are important. What I think is really interesting, though, is that Mexicans coming to the U.S. seems to help Americans' opinion of Mexico as well. And so travel can be in the other direction, and it still matters. I have lots of conversations with folks down in Texas who say, what would we do without the Mexican tourists coming up here and their shopping for our local communities? And actually, in an elevator yesterday morning, there was a guy from Brownsville, and he said, I don't know what we'd do without Matamoros. And it was an interesting thing to hear from somebody who lives on the border, but not entirely unexpected. And of course, Mexican students studying here in the United States matters a great deal as well. And just as Chris pointed out, in those states where you see more Mexican immigration, there tends to be a more favorable view of Mexico as well. So it's an interesting thing. Just lastly, Mark, on your issue, I think there's one way in which the bilateral relationship impacts upon the election this year, and that's if the NAFTA is terminated. Then that's a bad thing for the incumbent, of course. If NAFTA is saved, I don't think it's necessarily a good thing for the incumbent. So I think that the PRI are in a really difficult situation right now. I think that they only stand to lose from this, and so they have to do their absolute utmost to try to make sure that this continues, or that the negotiations continue beyond their mandate. The last thing they want is a termination or a U.S. withdrawal, because I think other people benefit more than they do in that situation. But I agree with you; it's not a deciding issue in the election.
I think also the economy would take a hit if that would happen.
Yeah.
The pace that they get now.
Absolutely, yes. And headlines on that are terrible. We've reached the end of our time. I'd like to thank you all for being here. I'd like to thank the Mexico Institute team for organizing this, in particular our birthday lady today, Angela Robertson. We'll be singing Las Mañanitas later on, but thanks for being here. Angela, I can't believe you didn't have anything better to do today. I mean, because we're paying you. Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks, ladies.